Kalen slammed his thumb onto the detonator, watching the massive ice shelf groan and shatter above the dark-armored hunters. A roar of collapsing frost swallowed the valley, white plumes rising like ghosts to meet the obsidian sky. He didn't look back to see if it was enough. Do you think one moment of courage can outweigh a lifetime of looking out for number one? Or is survival always a solo game? Join us as we find out. 6 days earlier, the heating element in Kalen's boots had finally flickered and died, leaving his toes to the mercy of Kalem 9's eternal winter. He was a scavenger by trade, a man who viewed the galaxy as a collection of parts to be stripped and sold. To Kalen, the cold was a slow killer, but the silence of a dead world was the one that truly bit. He spent his hours trudging through hip-deep drifts, dragging a reinforced sled laden with rusted hull plating and salvaged copper wiring. His breath came in ragged, frozen plumes, and his internal map was a frantic calculation of calorie burn versus distance. It was a lonely, mechanical existence, governed by the rhythm of the wind and the fading glow of his suit's power cell. Everything changed when he found the tracks. They weren't human, nor were they the heavy, geometric prints of the Obsidian Guard scouts. These were delicate, three-toed indentations that pulsed with a faint, dying bioluminescence against the blue-white snow. Kalen followed them, driven by a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. The trail led him to a jagged tier in the mountainside, a cavern that breathed a soft, rhythmic light. Inside, the air smelled of ozone and ancient dampness. Deep in the throat of the cave, huddled against a wall of glowing moss, sat Lyra. She was ethereal, skin etched with circuit patterns that dimmed with every shallow breath. In her lap and tucked under her thin arms were 3 children, their eyes wide and glassy with the unmistakable hollow look of starvation. I don't do forever, and I definitely don't do breakfast plans, but for them I'll make an exception. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out his last reserves. A handful of crinkled silver nutrient wafer wrappers caught the bioluminescent light as he held them out. Lyra didn't reach for them. Instead, she looked into his eyes with a terrifying intensity, her voice a melodic rasp that bypassed his ears and echoed directly in his mind. She offered him her soul bond, an eternal tether of her people's essence, in exchange for the survival of her offspring. Kalen looked at the wafers. They were his ticket to the extraction point 3 days away. Without them, his chances of making it through the Black Winter were less than 10%. He looked at the youngest child, whose hand was a tiny, trembling claw reaching for the silver foil. The silence of the cave felt heavier than the mountain above. Truth is, Kalen had never been a hero. He was the guy who ran when the sirens screamed, but as he watched the light in the children's skin flicker toward total darkness, he felt a strange, localized heat in his chest that had nothing to do with his suit's life support. He dropped the wafers into Lyra's lap. She offered me her soul for a piece of chocolate, but it was the look in the kid's eyes that actually bought me. The silence didn't last. Heavy, rhythmic thuds vibrated through the cavern floor, the sound of pressurized boots meeting stone. Kalen watched the shadows of the cave mouth stretch and sharpen. The Obsidian Guard had arrived. Their commander stood at the threshold, a silhouette of jagged, matte black armor that seemed to drink the bioluminescent light of the moss. "Step away from the anomalies, scavenger," the commander's voice boomed, distorted by a vox grill. Kalen didn't move. He felt the weight of the thermal welder in his hand, a tool meant for cutting salvage, not killing soldiers. But as he glanced back at Lyra, he saw the silver wafer wrapper in the smallest child's hand. It was licked clean, smoothed out by tiny fingers, a shimmering badge of a life that wasn't ready to end. He stood up. His knees popped, and the cold bit deeper into his deadened toes. "They aren't anomalies," Kalen said, his voice surprising him with its steady grit. "They're just hungry." The commander raised a heavy pulse rifle. Behind him, a dozen more shadows leveled their weapons. Kalen knew the math. one human with a glorified blowtorch against a squad of elite hunters. The odds weren't just bad, they were non-existent. In that moment, Kalen understood the science of the shelf above them. Kalem 9 wasn't just a rock. It was a pressurized system of frozen gases and unstable ice. The thermal welder's beam wouldn't melt the shelf. It would flash boil the trapped pockets of liquid nitrogen, creating a localized expansion that the structural integrity of the mountain couldn't support. It was a one-way trip for everyone in the blast zone. He looked at Lyra one last time. Her circuit skin flared a desperate, brilliant gold. Kalen slammed his thumb onto the detonator, watching the massive ice shelf groan and shatter above the dark-armored hunters. The world turned into a screaming white void. He felt the rush of displaced air, the roar of a mountain falling, and then a sudden, impossible warmth. He was pinned against the back of the cave, the entrance completely sealed by millions of tons of debris. He should have been crushed, but a barrier of golden light shimmered inches from his face. The youngest child stood before him, arm outstretched, eyes glowing with the intensity of a dying star. The light didn't just hold back the rubble, it seemed to push back the very concept of the winter outside. The hunters were gone. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. Lyra approached him in the dim, golden glow. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch searing through the layers of his thermal suit. She didn't speak, but he felt the title settle into his bones like a brand, Shield Bearer. 3 days later, the storm cleared. Kalen stood at the new mouth of the cave, looking out over a valley transformed by the avalanche. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his ship's distress beacon. It was a small, blinking device that promised to return to the galaxy he knew, to the bars, the scrapyards, and the lonely safety of his cockpit. He looked at the children playing in the snow, their skin circuits pulsing in rhythm with the rising sun. The silver wrapper was tucked into the youngest one's belt, a tiny trophy of their survival. Kalen dropped the beacon into the snow and crushed it under his boot. The black winter was over. As the first true sunlight hit the valley, Kalen didn't see a dead world anymore. He saw a home. Would you trade a ticket off that rock for a family that wasn't even your own species? Come back tomorrow for the next chronicle from the stars.